We're going to look at the origins of writing, one of the, many people would say, important developments in the history of humanity. Writing appears all over the world at different points. It's invented independently by different civilizations, and we're going to look at the system of Mesopotamia. So, what is writing? Well, we know what it is. Could we define it? There's several definitions. People disagree with certain definitions, such as this one: a system of graphic symbols that can be used to convey any and all thought. That's one definition of writing. But, it's essentially using symbols to communicate language. Language is as old as human beings, but writing is only 5,000 years old, a little bit over 5,000 years old. In some civilizations, like in Mesopotamia, there is a connection between the development of the state and writing. In other societies, it's a little bit less of a strong connection. How did early scholars determine how to crack the writing system of ancient Mesopotamia, and how did they figure out how it originated? Well, they had to work backwards. First, they were able to decipher Old Persian, as we saw from the inscription on the rock cliff face in Iran. Then, as they accumulated more samples of writing and more clay tablets, they were able to translate the slightly older language of Akkadian. And then, again, once finding more tablets, they were then able to crack the writing system of Sumerian. So writing develops in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. We have different writing systems in the Hittite Empire, in Greece. We've got Maya writing systems. Writing in the Indus Valley in India, as we're going to see, which had trading connections with Mesopotamia. They developed a writing system that has not been deciphered yet. And, of course, Chinese and other Asian writings. All right, so how did it start in Mesopotamia? Well, there's debate, but one theory is that writing actually started from clay tokens that predated writing. It turns out that all over Mesopotamia and other parts of the Near East, archaeologists have found these tokens made out of clay, and it looks like these different tokens symbolize different goods. And this was not a currency system. These didn't have value. It was a way of counting or keeping track of things. You could keep track of different amounts of things. For example, this, you can see, looks like a dog's head. This looks like a pomegranate. This croissant-shaped thing is actually supposed to be a metal ingot. This looks like a jar with a stopper. You'll see that this kind of circular disc with a cross in it represents sheep, or a variety of sheep. Now, why is this a good counting system? Why is it, for example, better than notches on a piece of wood or notches on bone? Because you could certainly keep track of amounts by, cutting notches into a stick or a piece of bone. But what you can't do with notches is subtract. You can do that with tokens. You could also represent different things, and you can't do that with notches on a stick, for example. Right? You can see the different kinds of tokens here and some of the things that they represent, like sheep. So we have these tokens, and then in the Uruk period, these tokens predate the Uruk period, and they're continued to be used in the Uruk period. But then the change that we start to see is we start to find these bulla. Bulla is Latin for bubble. These are clay balls that have tokens inside. So they would take a ball of clay, hollow it out, put in the tokens, close it up, and then they would take this seal. We talked about cylinder seals. We'll look more at cylinder seals. But these are pieces of stone with pictures carved in them. And when you roll the cylinder seal over the wet clay, it creates an impression. In fact, some people jokingly referred to this as the earliest 3D printing. It is, in a sense. You're rolling that piece over the clay and you're creating a seal. Now, why do we seal things? Well, we want to know if people have tampered with something. As we said, seals usually imply control or administration or bureaucracy. So these are seals from jar stoppers. They would stop up the jar with a piece of clay and then roll the seal over it. And these are some of the bulla. Archaeologists still find these bulla with tokens inside of them. So some bulla are broken open, and some bulla are actually found by archaeologists with the contents still inside, and that's what's being shown here. This is an X-ray of a sealed bulla showing the tokens inside. Okay, and we find these bulla throughout southern Mesopotamia, and as we saw in some of those Uruk colonies as well. So it was a desire by people to keep a record of the amounts of different goods, but to not have anyone tamper with the numbers, right, to change the numbers. So here you can see people using cylinder seals to seal baskets and jars and things like that. And it's not tamper-proof, it's tamper-evident. That is, you can see if someone has opened it or not. So this was a record of amounts of different things, goods, right? And it was sealed so that people who would get the record would know that the record had not been tampered with. And here you can see a piece of stone rolled over wet clay and the impression that's made. A lot of the Uruk seals show aspects of life during the Uruk period, either depictions of leadership and this kingly figure, or daily life, or, as we saw, weaving and storage and production and things like that. Now, we still seal things today. We use electronic seals now, or electronic signatures. But you'll notice that a lot of the things we buy in the store have a seal on them. And this really picked up, and I remember this well. I was a kid, but in the 80s, there was a series of Tylenol poisonings. It looked like, this was a time when the Tylenol bottle was not sealed. There's no reason to, I guess, at that point. But it looks like someone had taken Tylenol bottles off the shelf, opened up the capsules, put in cyanide, and then brought back the bottles and put it back on the shelf. Unsuspecting people bought these tainted bottles, and you can see people actually died. And this caused quite a stir. So what did the Tylenol company do? Well, we know the answer. They decided to seal the bottles with an official seal. And it was actually triple sealed. So the sort of tinfoil seal, the plastic seal around the cap, and I think the seal on the box. That way you were sure of the safety, right? And if an official seal, this was not a piece of Scotch tape with a Sharpie on it, Sharpie signature on it. This was a seal. And what the seal means to us is we know that someone from the factory with official power sealed the bottle, right? That is, it's quality control because we know someone in charge actually did the sealing. And that's important. And that's why some archaeologists feel that seals are kind of a marker for administration and bureaucracy and control. And the same system is still used today in Turkey, where we did archaeological work. So, for example, when I was a graduate student, I had to bring a suitcase back filled with animal bones, so that, and this, we had permission from the museum to do this. This was for a graduate student to work on their dissertation, studying these animal bones. Now, obviously, if I showed up to the airport with a suitcase full of bones and put that on the x-ray machine, people would ask questions. So the way it's officially done is the suitcase is brought to the museum. The bones are brought to the museum. The people at the museum pack the suitcase with the bones. Then they wrap wire around the suitcase and around the zipper. And then they use a lead seal on the wire using the official stamp of the museum and give me back the suitcase, along with a letter that is signed by the head of the museum stating that I am allowed to export these bones back to the United States. And when I went to the airport, the customs people carefully checked the seals to make sure that they were intact, because if they weren't, then it's possible that I did something, such as stuff something else in there that I wasn't supposed to do. But they saw the seals were intact, and they saw the leather, and they knew that that suitcase had not been handled by me, except to carry it. But I had not opened it since the officials had actually sealed it. Okay, so some group or some people in Mesopotamia, and most of these bulla are found in the Ayanna precinct in Uruk, wanted to make sure that no one tampered with their records of the amounts of different things. Then what do we see? Well, we start to see impressions in the bulla. Right? You can see these impressions. Now, what these impressions are impressions from the tokens. So, you can have a bulla sealed, tokens inside, and on the outside is the number of, it's telling you how many tokens are in the bulla. So, you've got the seal, tokens, and the impressions. One of those things is not necessary anymore. Can you guess what it is? What don't you need? The answer is the tokens. You don't need the tokens anymore, because if you have a seal on the clay and you make impressions on it, that's enough. That's a record. So you don't actually need the tokens, and by 3400 BC, the tokens disappear. They would just take a round piece of wet clay, and of course they wrote on clay in Mesopotamia, as we talked about before, because they didn't have a lot of wood, but they had plenty of clay. They did have reeds, and they did not make papyrus like they did in Egypt. It was much easier to write on clay, and good thing for us, because all this writing has survived from thousands of years ago. So these are the first tablets: signature, making it official, and numbers. And you can see some of the seals again show, these are from Habuba Kabira, that Uruk Mesopotamian colony we talked about. Some of these seal impressions also show, you can see it looks like scribes with tablets recording the amounts of different goods. So it's actually a cylinder seal showing some of these scribes. I like to think of this as the beginnings of IT, the first information technology. They're taking data and they're storing it in a hard form. It is really information technology. Some of these records have survived 5,000 years. How long will information stored on our computers last in the future? We can read the accounts of people from 5,000 years ago. So this is a way of making information permanent. It really was information technology. Then what they started to do was to draw pictures of the tokens. And what they essentially created were pictograms. Each picture symbolizes a specific thing. Like, as you can see here, dog and sheep, rug and hill. So most of these tablets are recordings of the amounts of things. Payment to the temple, or how much is in the storage facility in the temple, or how much they have to pay certain workers. So here you can see these cones and dots represent numbers. The pictures represent the things. This is a boar's head, so here's the amount of pigs. This is fish. A lot of these pictograms look like what they're supposed to be. So the amount of fish, here's a jar, the amount of, let's say, oil or something else that would have been in that jar. And you can see them becoming, from the tokens to the carvings inside of or on the clay. This is a very early tablet from the Uruk period. And again, you can see the amounts. This is a time period. This is the good and maybe what it was used for. And then also possibly the signature of the person doing the accounting. What you can see here at this point, the switch or the change that occurs, is you can see this pig's head here and the fish and the jar. Well, scribes realized that it was easier to turn the signs 90 degrees counterclockwise and start writing them in the clay that way. It made it a lot easier. So all the signs now are turned over. And so from this tablet, right, this originally would be standing straight up and down. And what it symbolizes is barley. Looks like a sheath of barley. These are numbers. This is actually the quantity of barley. This is the time period, the number of months. This is possibly the name of the person again. This is also what the barley might have been used for. That is maybe for exchange or trade. So this person's name might have been Kushim, based on these two symbols put together. This might have been one of the earliest uses of the pictograms to sound out something. There's some debate about that. Right? But again, keeping track of amounts. The Mesopotamian numerical system at this point was sexagesimal, right? Division by 60. Whenever you look at the clock, if you look at the non-digital clock, think of the Mesopotamians, because the reason why we divide the hour into 60 minutes and the reason why we divide the circle into 360 degrees is because of the ancient Mesopotamians. That's a holdover from Mesopotamia. So you can see a small cone represents 1, a small dot represents 10, a large cone represents 60, a large cone with a dot inside of it represents 600, and so on. So these tablets were divided into blocks so that they could separate the different things and talk about the amount of this, the amount of that. And ultimately, this is record keeping. So we went from tokens to tokens in Bulla, to tablets with these pictograms on them, to then tablets with the pictograms written sideways. Right? Some of these pictograms, again, look like what they're supposed to represent. This is barley. You can see it here. This is beer. Beer is represented as a jar with lines on it. This is a ziggurat, and it represents the temple. Now, remember we looked at bevel-rim bowls. Bevel-rim bowls might have been ration bowls to pay workers. And again, we find them in great quantities in Mesopotamia. Well, bevel-rim bowls also look like the symbol for bread, which is ninda. And on many of these tablets, a head plus bread in some contexts means to eat, but it also in other contexts means to distribute rations or disbursement of rations. So, for example, on this tablet, which is talking about an allocation of beer, you can see that in the lower left here, there's this head and what looks like a bevel-rim bowl, meaning ninda, and this means allocation. So this tablet is talking about the amount of beer and other things that was paid to workers. Now, by the late Uruk period, scribes had 1,500 different signs So, there wasn't just one sign for sheep. There's one sign for one kind of sheep, but for a young sheep, called an ewe, there would be a different kind of sign. And so every single variation had to have its own sign, right? So you can see udu, sheep, right? An ewe, a lamb, and then related to that, wool, cloth or garment, and then another type of cloth, right? Each variation had to have its own sign. So that made things rather complicated. 1,500 different signs. Here's another tablet from Uruk. This is an account of different kinds of grain products, bread, beer, and butter oil. Here is a small tablet, and some of the signs you'll be able to recognize because they look like what they're supposed to represent, right? Udu or sheep. This ab is a ziggurat, so there's the temple. This is one, this is one. This symbol means on, and it usually means divinity or divine. It's a sort of star-like shape. Before any name, it means divine, that name is going to be of a god or goddess. This is supposed to be that reed bundle that we saw before that represents Inanna. Now, we don't know exactly what they're trying to say, but it seems like two sheep, related to the temple of Inanna. Is it being given or is it being stored? We're not exactly sure. So sometimes these things can be hard to decipher. The next step was a new development, because it took a long time to scratch these characters into the clay, to draw them. And these Mesopotamians are trying to come up with an easier way to do it. And what they came up with was to take a stylus, a piece of reed that was wedge-shaped, and instead of incising the clay, what they used was the stylus to press into the clay and make wedge characters, which was actually much faster than drawing it. And using these wedge-shaped characters, they then could create these pictograms. Now, cuneiform means wedge-shaped writing. So this is the first cuneiform. At the end of the Uruk period, they're taking those pictograms, and instead of inscribing them, they're drawing them using wedge-shaped characters, right? So you can see, and then after that period, these characters become more and more abstract, until by the period of 500 BC, the characters do not really look like the original tokens anymore, right? But here's sheep, still becomes a circle, becomes a cuneiform kind of circle, then becomes a cuneiform box, then becomes more abstract. Here's cattle, so the head of a cattle, again, written in cuneiform, the head of a dog, written in cuneiform, a metal ingot, written in cuneiform, and then becoming very abstract, a jar of oil, written in cuneiform, a garment, again, bracelet, perfume. You can see the cuneiform characters. I have a little demonstration in the next video where I show you how to do this with a chopstick or a piece of wood you might have. You'll probably have a chopstick laying around, hopefully, and any kind of clay or Play-Doh that you have in your house. Hopefully you have some clay laying around, because I think it would be fun for you guys to try and write a little bit of cuneiform. And then when you're applying for a job and they ask for a writing sample, you could just give them that. This is my writing sample. But you can see the way the ancient scribes would use cuneiform and use the stylus on the clay. Now you'll notice that it's much easier to rotate the tablet than it is to rotate your hand with the stylus. So to write horizontal versus vertical lines, you rotate the tablet rather than rotate the stylus. Also, you can see the point here. You would use the corner of your chopstick, and if you put the chopstick in at sort of a perpendicular angle, right, very kind of steep angle, you'll get a small wedge. If it's a very shallow angle, you're going to get a much longer wedge. So that's how you create some of these different characters. Okay, so you can see this is a Sumerian tablet where that character for barley is now written in cuneiform. Now you're going to try and write this, sheep and 16, a large dot and 6 small cones. I'm going to show you how to do that in the next video. Okay, so if you have a piece of clay and you have a chopstick at home, you might be able to do this. If you got Sculpey or Play-Doh or something like that, and you take a piece of this and you kind of flatten it into a tablet like so, right? You'll get something like one of these Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets. Right? Then if you take your chopstick and you use the edge, right, and you place it kind of at an angle, if you do it like so, you'll get a small wedge. And if you do it more like this, you'll get a longer wedge, right? So let's try something like that. You could kind of see a longer wedge. Let me do a little bit better job with that. So if you place it kind of like this, you'll get a small wedge. And if you place it more at an angle, you're going to get, it's going to be lengthened like so. So it will be a slightly longer wedge. Now, in order to do the numbers, you use the round part of the chopstick. If you put it straight up and down like this, you'll get a dot, and the dot represents 10. Now, if you place the round part at an angle, you're going to get a cone like that. And a cone represents 1. So you want to record 16 sheep. Now, the great thing about clay is, of course, if you make a mistake, you just crumple up and roll it out again into kind of a tablet. The tablets were not flat pancakes. They were sort of thick. They had to stand up to, to some abuse. So they weren't be these things that shattered on impact. They would be, something kind of like this, right? Okay, so in order to make 16 sheep, you're going to kind of make a box, and it's easier to turn the tablet than it is to turn the stylus. So you could turn the tablet, but you kind of make a box. And I'm not doing a great job, but I'll show you. And then you make a cross in the middle of the box. I didn't do such a great job this time, but something like that. And then to make 16, you would do 1 dot for 10, like that. And then you would make 6 cones. And that would be 16. So it would be kind of held up like this. Here you go, 16 sheep. So try it. I'm going to show you the picture again so you get an idea of what it looks like, and you'll get to practice a little cuneiform.